And I'm really pleased that we have to start off this panel, John Rosenthal. John has been one of those people who was way out ahead of the rest of us on this issue. He has been thinking and writing and working on this issue for decades. Those of you who may have once in a while decided to go to Fenway Park to see our baseball team that thankfully are now the Eastern Division champs have probably walked across that bridge over the Mass Turnpike, and you have probably seen a huge billboard which has given you some statistics about the grim reality of gun violence in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in our society. That is John and his group. He has been a leader in terms of thinking, writing, analyzing, educating, and communicating the extent of the gun violence problem in our society. And he comes to us as the co-founder of not just Stop Handgun Violence, which of course, as the name implies, is what we are trying to do, but he also has another group, the American Hunters and Shooters Association. John is a hunter. John understands and respects the safe recreational use of firearms, but he also understands that when we're not killing animals, but we're killing human beings, it's a whole different problem that we need to do something about. So without further ado, John, thank you so much for coming. John Rosenthal.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I guess first and foremost, it's always important when talking about guns to talk about the Second Amendment, because it seems to be one of those threshold issues and really misunderstood. I am a gun owner. I've been a gun owner my whole adult life. I love to skeet shoot. I have shotguns, and like a lot of gun owners in Maine, I was living in Vermont at the end of a long road with wildlife and bears and horses, and I thought it would be a really good idea to have a shotgun for self-protection as much as anything else, or to be able to put down a horse if it was attacked by a bear. I am not an advocate of banning all guns by any stretch of the imagination, but as someone that has hunted, I can tell you that when you hunt, if you hunt deer, I mean, you need a license. If you hunt duck, you need a license. And when you hunt deer and duck, for deer, you're limited to 5 rounds to protect the deer population. And when you hunt duck, 3 rounds to protect the deer population. And then you take it to sort of the civilian ownership of firearms. I mean, we give our police 13 to 17 rounds in their service weapons to protect us. Why on earth are we giving criminals and the dangerously mentally ill and even international terrorists that are on YouTube, like Jihadi Joe, saying come to the U.S., buy AK-47s and large capacity ammunition magazines because you can do it without detection? It made no sense to me. So as a business person and a gun owner in 1995 with my buddy, the late Michael Kennedy, one of Bobby Kennedy's kids, the Attorney General's kids, we built this enormous billboard, 250 feet next to the Mass Pike, and we put up color photographs of kids killed by guns and said the cost of handguns keeps going up, 15 kids killed every day. At that point in 1995, 106 Americans died every single day from firearms. It was roughly 40,000 Americans that year. And on average, 32 to 35,000 Americans die every single year from firearms. I mean, if you go back 40 years, that's more Americans killed by firearms than all U.S. service men and women killed in all foreign wars combined. And there's no background check for all gun sales? I mean, imagine if hamburgers killed 90 Americans today. Do you think that the meat packers would still be unregulated? But not only, is the gun industry unregulated, they were given immunity from lawsuits by the Bush administration, so they can't be sued. so they can sell guns to anyone they want without any accountability. So what I wanted to do was try and change the conversation from banning guns or unlimited access to guns to how are kids and criminals and the dangerously mentally ill accessing firearms. What can be done to reduce that access without banning guns? So what we did in Massachusetts is first start to change the conversation from banning or unlimited access to how are kids and criminals accessing guns. And the Second Amendment clearly reads, I mean, the interpretations have been different over the years. A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And in the Heller case, the DC gun ban case, Justice Scalia clearly, he wrote for the majority, and he said you can't ban guns in the common use of the time of the founders. And then he even went on to say, and I don't mean assault weapons, because they weren't, but you can put reasonable restrictions on how they are sold. And so the conversation is going to come down to what's a reasonable restriction. But you can put reasonable restrictions on how they are sold. That's what the Supreme Court ruled. The Supreme Court did not rule that you can't ban guns and background checks are unconstitutional. So it's going to come down to what's reasonable. And I think Massachusetts is probably going to be the testing ground for that because, in my estimation, we have reasonable gun laws. And guess what, folks? I mean, since we enacted our gun laws, and since 1994, when we started to change this whole conversation, the state of Massachusetts has reduced gun deaths by 60%, which is the NRA's worst nightmare. Gun laws work. So in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, if you're a gun owner like me, you have to store your gun safely unless it's in your direct control. I mean, the NRA and tried to misinform everybody and our legislators about the fact, and including a Republican governor that signed this into law, that, how then can I protect myself at night if, an intruder comes in? The law says unless it's not in your direct control. So if you want to sleep with your hand on a loaded pistol under your pillow, have at it. But you leave your home, the gun has to be, and you're not with the gun, it has to be locked. If a kid accesses that firearm, you're liable. And when that law was passed in '98, right after that, we saw an 81% reduction in the 1 to 5-year-old population dying from firearms. It was a small number, but it was a high percentage. So you got to keep your gun safely stored unless it's in your direct control. It's tougher on criminals who break and enter into homes, and they go for your opioids in the medicine cabinet, and they go for the guns under your bed or in the bedside table. You talk to the criminals, that's what they do. If you're a gun manufacturer, you have to put safety features on your guns. So, Smith & Wesson, largest handgun maker in America, in our own state of Massachusetts in Springfield, Mass. If you want to sell the guns in Massachusetts, you have to put a minimum safety features, and the guns have to be a certain tensile strength. They can't be made of plastic. There's a drop test. There's a barrel length requirement. Because if you buy a toy gun in this country, you can't buy one legally without a little red dot at the end of the barrel. It tells a police officer it's a toy. That's a federal manufacturing standard. But real firearms that will result in 90 dead today and 200 shot, no manufacturing standards whatsoever. The weapon used at Fort Hood, it's a Herzl 22 caliber handgun. It was legally marketed as being able to penetrate 48 layers of soft body armor. Who wears soft body armor? Police and MPs. That's why that weapon was used at Fort Hood, where people would be wearing soft body armor. The weapons used at Columbine High School were marketed, legally marketed, as having a finish resistant to fingerprints. You can buy that weapon at a gun show here in Maine for about $450 with a 30-round magazine. So in Massachusetts, you got to sell guns with minimum safety standards. First in the nation. If you're a gun dealer in Massachusetts, you have to operate out of a bona fide store separate from your car, trunk, or backpack, which is perfectly legal here in Maine. And so the background check law is important because if you're a federally licensed gun dealer, you have to run a background check. You know, sadly, in this state, you could be a federally licensed gun dealer and operate out of your home. We don't allow that in Massachusetts. But if you can't pass a background check, then you simply go to, what is it, Uncle Henry's, or you go to, you know, your neighbor or a gun show, and you can buy a gun without an ID or a background check. And the criminals and the terrorists know it. I mean, go on YouTube, look at Jihadi Joe. I mean, the whole bit, you know, ISIS, terrorists from offshore saying, come to the U.S., buy assault weapons. So we in Massachusetts, you know, have tried to address gun owners, dealers, manufacturers, and law enforcement, and that combination, including a background check for all gun sales. Whether you're a private owner like me who can sell up to 4 guns a year from our own private collection, or anyone else has to run a background check. And it's proven to work. The only thing that we ban in Massachusetts are the 19 assault weapons that were in the federal ban and large capacity ammunition magazines. You know, it's just truth is stranger than fiction when you think that, you know, for hunting deer and duck, to protect them, you're limited in number of rounds, but to hunt people, you're not. It just makes no sense. But we've proven that gun laws work, and without an infringement on law-abiding gun owners, and we support law enforcement. It's just not more complicated than that. You know, sadly, we have a special interest gun lobby that is incredibly well funded, largely not by its membership. I mean, just to understand the NRA, if you pay $35 and become a member of the NRA, you can't vote for the board of directors. You have to give $1,000 and be a lifetime member to vote for the board of directors. So they say they have 4 million members, but only 60,000 can vote. And they vote in guys like Ted Nugent. If any of you saw the rant recently, Ted Nugent's on the board of the NRA. He posted on the internet pictures of 12 people with Jewish last names and said, these people are, and I was one of them, and Bloomberg was one of them, and it said, these people are responsible for gun control. We need to shut them down. And that all went, you know, viral. Basically, you know, suggesting that we be taken out for simply wanting to reduce preventable gun violence. And all we're trying to do is prevent senseless deaths. And we need to be as vigilant. I am thrilled that the state of Maine, you know, the rural state of Maine, has taken this issue up. I can tell you from living, you know, in Massachusetts, 2/3 of all guns traced to crime in Massachusetts come from Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So if the majority of folks in Maine vote the right way on background checks, they're not only saving their own children's lives and their own family members' lives, you know, they're having an impact on states around them. So I really encourage you to get the word out and to get this done. I think you know, given the fact that 91% of Americans polled support background checks for all gun sales, including gun owners and NRA members, a high percentage, we just need to make this a voting issue. We need to get people to the polls. And we can, as I keep saying, you know, we don't need to ban guns in order to to reduce gun violence. I mean, that's the most important thing I can tell you. The second most important, or maybe the more important, is your kids are going to visit homes where there are loaded and unlocked guns. And of the 8 kids that will die today in America, 3 will probably die that way, simply accessing some loaded and unlocked gun. I mean, we live in a country, folks. I mean, this is still a democracy, and we've got to participate. But we live in a country where every 3 hours a kid dies from a firearm that they shouldn't have access to. And those are happening here in Maine, as a result of suicides at a much higher rate than anywhere else, than certainly Massachusetts. Every 30 minutes, a kid is shot. I mean, is that really the kind of country we want as adults? To say, we're responsible for that. And there's something that can be done about it. And it doesn't have to get into this banning or unlimited access issue. It just has to get into common sense, and then we have to be as committed to saving lives as the gun industry is committed to selling guns, and the NRA is as committed to having unrestricted access to guns. And this is the part where most people would say, maybe they'll stop listening to me, but I know it to be true. I have been at this as a gun owner and a business person since 1995. That is 750,000 dead Americans ago from guns. And I can tell you that even an urban industrial state like Massachusetts has proven that you can dramatically reduce gun deaths. I mean, in Maine, your firearm fatality rate is 9.4 people per 100,000 population. You are in a rural state. In urban industrial Massachusetts with 6.5 million people, our firearm fatality rate is 3.1. This is an urban state with big cities like Boston, Springfield, Holyoke, Chicopee, gang members with unrestricted access to guns, thanks to Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, where there's no background check requirement. I mean, the Craigslist killer went to New Hampshire. I can tell you, I know gang members who have come to Maine. It's because they can. It's easy. So, last year, there was a mass shooting of 4 or more people every single day of the year in America. Just like the one that happened in South Carolina the other day at an elementary school. Every single day. And the common denominator for those mass shootings are these AR-15s and large capacity ammunition magazines that have no regulations, that anyone can buy, that thousands of gun shows are from private individuals without an ID or background check. I mean, if you need a background check to be a bus driver or a Little League coach, why wouldn't you have a background check for an inherently dangerous product like a firearm? So try and think about this issue as if it's another inherently dangerous product, like an automobile. Automobiles are made to drive. They're not made to kill. And we require training, licensing. We hold the car industry accountable, which is how we've reduced car deaths so dramatically. We had the keys of the courthouse, which you're supposed to have, and speaking to lawyers, we live in a country where we have this system where you're supposed to have the keys of the courthouse to hold businesses and government accountable, but we don't when it comes to gun violence. The gun industry has no responsibility or accountability, period. There's no way to hold them accountable, and you can't sue them. So when you think about why is there this increase in mass shootings and with particular kind of weapons, it's by design. So if you come up with a way to allow the industry that makes the product to not be sued, and you don't have a background check so that criminals and terrorists and mentally ill can buy guns without detection, and you make police the enemy of gun rights, well, of course you're going to have an epidemic of gun violence. And then, when you have an epidemic of gun violence, you have the associated fear, especially combined with an anti-government attitude. So government and law enforcement, they're the enemy. Law enforcement's the enemy of gun rights. Let's give criminals more rounds before they have to reload than law enforcement, which is the case in this country. More fear, more gun violence, more fear, more gun sales, especially high-profile mass shootings. Look what happens after every high-profile mass shooting. Sandy Hook, Orlando, Virginia Tech. You can just go down the list. Spikes in gun sales after every high-profile mass shooting. That's the game, folks. And we're losing it because the gun industry and the gun lobby is much more dedicated to selling guns and frankly, at any cost, than we, the 91% of Americans that support background checks, in holding our legislatures and our Congress accountable. So, in closing, I just want to leave with some hope, which is, this urban industrial state just south of you has proven that background checks and holding gun owners, dealers, and manufacturers accountable without banning guns can dramatically reduce gun violence. And in your state, where 75% of people sort of die from firearms due to suicide, which, compared to about 22% in Massachusetts, that's really low-hanging fruit, folks. I mean, that is really where a background check is going to come into play. And it's really where safe storage. I mean, gun owners responsible gun owners like me and like anyone else out there who knows you don't store a gun loaded and unlocked. You don't want criminals getting it, and you don't want your own kids getting it. We've grown up in that culture because of largely gun safety associated with hunting. But the NRA isn't satisfied. You look at any one of the covers of their magazines, it's not about hunting rights. It's about handguns and self-protection and fear. Because fear sells better than any other advertising. And it's sort of that simple. And we could be the lemmings and we can fall for it, or we can start to stand up to it. And so I love the fact that, even in the rural state of Maine, where it's been really hard to even have the conversation, you're starting to have the conversation. And it will save lives. And I really encourage you to just know that this doesn't have to be polarized. And that most gun owners, if they understood and they weren't listening to the self-interest of the NRA, they would understand what the Second Amendment really says, which is you can't ban guns, but you can put reasonable restrictions on how they are sold. And a background check is a reasonable restriction to help keep criminals and terrorists and the dangerously mentally ill from getting guns. And guess what? It'll save your kids' lives. Everybody knows that just being a teenager is temporary insanity. I mean, the last thing you want is to have unrestricted access to guns. So you combine a background check for accountability on who's buying with safe storage, and that 75%, murder rate or gun death rate, fatality rate from firearms in this state is going to drop dramatically. And you haven't even gotten into the things that are going to have a huge impact, like renewable licensing, like automobiles, or limiting the size of the magazines that are being used to outgun police. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Yes, we'll pull up a chair for you. Let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Dimitri Baum, a professor of constitutional law. To his left is Stephanie Anderson, the district attorney here in Cumberland County. To her left is Lois Reckitt, who is a domestic violence advocate, longtime advocate in this area. Mike Sawchuk, the the chief of the Portland Police Department, and Mark Dion. Mark Dion. He's a longtime sheriff here in Cumberland County. He is an attorney now. He is also a member of the Maine legislature who's running for the state senate. So, you each get 5 minutes, I guess, and we're going to start here and work to the outside. Dimitri, please start it off.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. I was asked to be on the panel to talk a little bit about the constitutional legal angle. I have a lot of sort of policy folks around me who can talk more about the policy of background checks. John stole my thunder a little bit by bringing up the Heller case, talking about the constitutional right. Of course, the Second Amendment in the federal Constitution. We have a similar provision in the Maine Constitution that's maybe even more more protective, stronger protective of gun rights. So as we talk about sort of what the scope of the Second Amendment is and what regulation it allows, I just want to start with the text. And the text I'm going to start with is a text of the First Amendment. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Sounds very absolute. Can Congress pass laws that limit speech? Of course they can, and they do quite a bit, right? There's a lot of speech that is banned by the states and by the federal government that receive no protection above the Constitution. Things like defamation, obscenity, child pornography. There's quite a bit of speech. True threats, fighting words. There's a lot of speech that, it's clearly speech as the word is defined, that receives no protection under the Constitution. Even core governmental speech, political speech, can be regulated as long as the government has a strong enough interest. Another right in the 14th Amendment, no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the laws. The core of the amendment is about equality. Can the government discriminate against people on the basis of race? The answer is yes, as long as they have a strong enough reason, right? So to figure out whether a regulation, a restriction is proper, what courts have created are called standards of scrutiny or tiers of scrutiny. And basically the way it works is when a law either discriminates on the basis of race or restricts speech or here regulates guns, the court looks to the reasons that the government offers for its regulation. Those are called the ends. And it looks at how closely tied the means are to those ends, right? Is a restriction aimed to address the goals that the government is trying to address, right? And so now that we recognize that every right, the most fundamental rights like the right to vote, the rights from discrimination, every right is subject to regulation. Let's jump back to the Second Amendment. Much of the debate nationally about the Second Amendment has been about, does it apply to individual rights? Is it an individual right or is it a collective right in relation to militia involvement? I think that issue has been decided by Heller. I mean, the court has said it's an individual right, and so I think it's important to have this debate and not minimize the Second Amendment right. It's a right that's equal to any other right in the Constitution. It's certainly not up to me or us in this room to say this right is a lesser right or is an inferior right to right of freedom of speech or unreasonable searches and seizures or equality under Equal Protection Clause. But that's just a starting point, right? It's important to remember that's the starting point of the conversation. Once we recognize this is an individual right, then the question becomes, when can the right be regulated? And the Heller decision itself tells you how. It tells you when the right can be regulated. The court says, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Although we do not undertake an exhaustive historical analysis of the full scope of the Second Amendment, nothing, in our opinion, should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws prohibiting the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications in the commercial sale of arms. Right? So the language of Heller itself tells you, yes, it's an individual right, it's an important right, but there can be quite a bit of regulation as long as it's targeting these categories where restrictions have historically been allowed. The court in Heller didn't tell us exactly what standard of scrutiny to apply, right? So sometimes the court applies strict scrutiny, the highest level of scrutiny, requiring the government to have a really good reason, a compelling reason, before it can restrict a right. Sometimes the court uses what's called a rational basis review. As long as it's a legitimate reason, it's proper. But lower courts handling, grappling with this issue have generally applied some variant of intermediate scrutiny. You ask how good the government's reason is, has to be an important reason, and the law has to be tied to that reason. And so as folks have talked about today, and I think folks will talk about in this panel, the reasons here for the government regulation, health, public health and safety, individual welfare, those are the most compelling reasons recognized by the law. So there's no question the rationale, the ends here are proper. And so then the question becomes one of means, right? Are the means being used in background checks, are they sufficiently related? Are they closely tied? Are they narrowly tailored, in the words of the court, to the ends that are being promoted? And that becomes a question of how well the law is linked to the goals it's trying to accomplish. But I think if the court's saying you can regulate possession of, or can ban possession by felons and the mentally ill, you certainly can have a system that tries to ensure that the mentally ill and the convicted felons don't have a chance to buy weapons and buy firearms. So ultimately, I'm not a policy guy. I'm certainly happy to talk more about the policy issues. But from the constitutional perspective, I think a well-tailored law that targets background checks, there's little doubt after Heller and the Second Amendment the right can be regulated.
Stephanie Anderson.
Thank you very much. Wow. I've been taking a couple of notes here, but I guess I will. I know in the opening remarks we were told that this was not a forum on question 3, but I think it is, because every person that sat up here has tried to convince you of how you should vote on question 3. And so I'm going to say, vote no. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Cumberland County District Attorney. I've been doing criminal law for 36 years. I've handled tens of thousands of cases, and I don't believe question 3 is going to make any bit of difference in violent crime in the state of Maine. The state of Maine already has a crime rate that is extremely low in the nation. It is the violent crime rate in Massachusetts, which has been touted as a state where we need to emulate their gun laws. The state of Massachusetts is almost 3 times higher than the state of Maine when it comes to violent crime. I don't have a problem with background checks. I think background checks are a good idea. I think background checks for anyone wanting to purchase a gun, I have no problem with that. But let's not kid ourselves. Number one, a background check is not going to prevent a jihadist or a terrorist from obtaining a weapon. It's not going to prevent a mentally ill person from obtaining a weapon. And it's not, I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on crime in the state of Maine. Now, I've heard a lot from the medical panel about 75% of the gun deaths in Maine are by suicide, and that is a tragic statistic, and there's no question about that. Out of 100 gun deaths last year in the state of Maine, 75 were by suicide, and that's a terrible thing, but no one's told me how this background check bill is going to affect that. I did hear a lot from the medical panelists that, to prevent suicide, we need to put in some common sense measures, and I think one of the best things I heard was if someone is in a rough spot, they should divest themselves of any guns they might have in their home. Well, I've got a personal story here. I was in a rough spot several years ago, and I am a gun owner. And I was in a rough spot. I didn't think I was anywhere close to putting that gun to my head, but a girlfriend of mine was concerned and said, I want to take your gun. And I said, okay, and I gave her my gun. Under this law, that would not be permissible. Under this law, the situation of the hunter who's going hunting and they're sharing a gun and he's got to leave 2 days earlier, the question that was posed to the medical panel, that behavior would be against this law. I think this law is way overbroad. It prevents common sense transfers that are indeed designed to protect public safety. The woman in the home whose husband is going off the rails and is getting violent, that domestic violence victim cannot take a gun out of her home and give it to a friend. She can take the gun to the police, but she can't take the gun out of her home and give it to a friend. She can't remove that gun for safekeeping. This law, I believe, is overbroad, and it's, more importantly, I don't think it's going to change gun violence in the state of Maine one iota. It is, it's not doing what we're purporting to do. I have no problem with background checks for criminals who purchase guns. It's the transfer provision that I think is way overbroad, unconstitutional, and will endanger public safety. In fact, I would go a step further and say I think anybody that wants to buy a gun needs to take that 8-hour gun safety course and bring their certificate in and show that they have had responsible training on how to operate a firearm. I don't have any problem with that at all. I've just been told I have 1 minute. So,
You have less than that, actually. I think we're going to get back to you on this too, Steph.
all
but
right, well.
Go ahead and wrap it up.
No, okay, I'm good.
You ready for the onslaught later on?
I am.
Go ahead and wrap up
Bring
with
it
your
on.
comments. Do you have a wrap up that you want to?
No,
Okay.
I just think the law is not gonna, it's not doing what it purports to do. And it will prevent, I think it will actually reduce gun safety.
Thank you. Lois Reckitt.
Bill, we're going to because of the order we were originally thinking about doing this,
You
I'm
do.
going to yield to
Yield your
Mark.
time to Mark Dion.
No, I'm not going to yield my time.
I'm
on that.
kidding. I should have known better.
I'm going to suggest that it.
All right,
it's
Mark,
more
you're up.
logical
Mark
for you to go
Dion.
Next.
Have to follow up Stephanie. Okay, she's clear.
When I stand, Mark, you have 1 minute.
No, there's parts of it I do agree with you. I to be part of this particular panel, how much time do I have, Bill?
4 minutes and 57 seconds.
All right. Usually I ignored the Speaker of the House when he gave me those instructions too. But I think my participation today is instructive. If we just take a little history lesson on the background check bill, we did pass in the 126. I was charged with guiding that bill through the process. I was its original sponsor, and I spent the entire session negotiating the contents of that bill. And I kind of sit back here in this whole conversation and go, wow, a lot of this really wasn't central to those debates. I was the only Democrat in the room. Others were Republican colleagues, members from the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. The chief lobbyist from the NRA had a seat at the table, and we hammered at these issues vigorously. A lot of this is preliminary conversations that we had in that room, but over the span of a year or more, we got a little deeper. So it wasn't about culture, it was about how we perceived the exercise of control in our own lives. Does the responsibility fall to the individual? Is it a community issue and we defer to them, that safety gets defined by others as opposed to ourselves? In terms of the transfer piece, we kind of avoided that because our central assumption to get through this process was Maine people are good people. The overwhelming majority of our citizens obey the law, go about their lives, demanding little of government other than to go about their lives. And we could trust that. So one of our values in that negotiation was not to unnecessarily criminalize Maine citizens. But we did want to create an opportunity for a shift in values, and we looked to the gun owners to do that. We looked at the concept that background checks make sense, they should occur, because we knew there were purchases being accomplished via third parties, either online or through periodicals that allowed disparate parties to come together anonymously, for the most part, and purchase a weapon. And as a former police officer, it seemed to me like to no good end. That those weapons weren't going to go join a hunting collection. They were going to be exercised in the use of a crime, maybe not here in Maine, but maybe somewhere else, and it made them not any less lethal. In terms of the transfers, I listened. I didn't do a lot of talking for a number of weeks. I listened to the reality of tradition. Maybe that was their code for culture. In that, as a practical matter, many of these transfers occur so quickly and so part of the seam of life that for us to intervene and say, stop, there's some paperwork, seemed an unnecessary intervention at that time. Now, for some of my colleagues on this particular referendum, these comments may be unsettling, I don't know, but I'm trying to be absolutely candid in terms of that process. Now, we did get to a place that we had a bill, and it was passed with a very narrow margin in the House, and one senator helped make it go over the edge in the Senate, and he told us in the hallway, that vote assures I won't be back. And it was cast nonetheless, and he did not return. And that was used against him, unfortunately. I thought it was a courageous act on his part. He voted what he thought was right. But right doesn't, 1 minute left?
You gotta talk faster like I did.
Fast? But I'll say this quickly. If we're going to talk about question 3, I didn't think we were. I'll vote to support the bill because I think the background piece, as it applies to third-party sales, is critical. A sale is a sale is a sale. And if the transfers present a problem, and I think they do, all right? I believed it then. I don't walk away from that belief now. Then we'll have to amend it in the legislature. But we went to the referendum process because in the legislature we would not get any bill through the executive branch. It's that simple. And I'll end there.
Thank you. Who would you like to have go next?
At me.
Okay. Lois Reckitt,
All right.
now batting.
Basically, I think because I only have 5 minutes, I'm not going to say a lot of things that I might otherwise have said, which would have been way more entertaining than what I will say. So just with that background. As Bill mentioned, I was a domestic violence advocate for a long time. I spent 36 years at Family Crisis Services, been retired for a year. December 7th, I get sworn into the legislature, so I'll be following behind Mark's trail in the next session. My experience with working with battered women and supervising those who were also doing that work is really what drove me to this issue. Because I knew that we heard story after story of women, predominantly, who were threatened with firearms, who were terrified in the context of their domestic violence relationship, and many of whom were killed with firearms. There was the reason that there is a homicide review panel in the state is because one year there were 6 women in our jurisdiction alone who were killed in domestic violence situations. And when the 6th woman was killed, we found ourselves, our office used to be, you'll feel terribly sorry for us, still is apparently, but used to be right near Portland Headlight, dreadful spot. Anyway, but we found ourselves after a staff meeting one day, most of the staff at that time, there were only, I think, maybe 15 of us then as opposed to the 30 when I left, but basically we were all down there crying together because we had just lost one too many women. And it was a dreadful thing. And we said to ourselves, as we often did, what can we do to make this not be the reality? Because I'm somebody who's, I've always said to people, if what I think is ought to be done is not legal because of some law, well, tell me which law, and I'll proceed to try to change it. So that was always my attitude about everything. But what we did in that tearful moment is start thinking about alternatives. And that's really where the concept of the Homicide Review Panel came from, is that conversation. It also came from the Domestic and Sexual Violence Task Force, because we talked about, there was a man on that panel at the time who was a state police officer who served on the Child Death and Serious Injury panel. And we realized that, there was a panel that was going to look at child death and serious injury. Why was no one looking at the deaths of adult victims of domestic violence? So that's how that all began to happen. And what happened as a result of analyzing the data over the course of several years, it's clear that half of the homicides in Maine are close, 50%, 53, depends on the year, are domestic violence homicides. And more than half of them are carried out with guns. That solved nothing except to tell us what we intuitively believed before, but it's good to have it written down, I suppose. What we did then was to, in later years, is to volunteer, not for any organized research project, but to track the number of cases that we were dealing with in the state across all of the domestic violence resource centers, which go all the way from way up north to way down south, and to track how many of those calls, those women, those cases had firearms involved. And so we began to come up with some data that said there was an awful lot of threatening going on, and we were keeping track of it finally, which we had never done. I haven't seen the results of the latest round of that tracking. I'm not sure who's compiling them, because I'm just mistrustful that the Department of Health and Human Services is paying much attention to that right now. But that is what we were doing to try to give the ammunition to say this is a really important piece for battered women. Lastly, I just want to say that one of the things that struck me as I was looking back on pieces about this particular issue on point right now is that when Connecticut passed background checks, they had a 40% decrease in domestic violence associated crimes that had firearms involved. And Missouri, who had those restrictions, when they repealed them, then the homicide rate went right up. And to me, looking at those two pieces of data said to me, really, we are on the right track. I tend to agree with Mark. If we discover there are particular inexplicable problems with the transfer provisions or whatever, then you look at them and you make minor changes. But I also agree that there's no way on God's green acres that we could ever get background checks past the executive branch in this state. And I think it needs to happen. So more power to people like Bill, who've spent so many years working on this issue. And a bunch of the others of us have as well, although not on this particular issue, but on the issue of gun safety in general.
Thank you, Lois. Now the Portland Police Chief, Mike Soschuk.
Yeah, thank you very much, and appreciate you coming out this afternoon and hanging in there with us. I will start by saying it's not often I'm happy to be at a table with three attorneys at the same time. But with some of the questions we're probably going to get, I'm pretty happy to be able to punt to a constitutional scholar and a district attorney of decades, former deputy chief of the Portland Police Department and sheriff and attorney and everything else. So I'm going to kick back after my 5 minutes and kind of chill up here a little bit. So what I'm going to do is draw a little bit of a correlation between two epidemics that we have in our society right now. And the first one I'm going to talk about is substance use issues here in our state and across our country. And then I'm going to draw a correlation to how that gets Mike back on track here for the firearms discussion here this afternoon. And I would tell you that in law enforcement, we work on a 90-10 principle, right? We spend 90% of our time dealing with 10% of the population. And it just so happens that the 10% of the population that we spend a great deal of time with has substance use disorders or mental health issues or both, and the co-occurring aspects of that. That's the reality of our world, period. I can tell you that. There are others up here that can tell you that all day long. And I don't say that to paint a broad brush and say that everybody is this or everybody is that. I can tell you that based on my 20 years of experience, that's who we end up working with. And when we have a strong epidemic like we have in our community now, you look out the window here and how beautiful it is, and go have to lobster roll this afternoon, and I'll tell you, we had 10 bank robberies in this community last year. The vast majority of them firearms, visible or threatened. I would tell you that because of the analysis that we've done around substance use issues in our community, that we found that 7 of the last 11 homicides in this community have been firearms related. All of them have been substance use related, but 7 of them were firearms related. And I draw that natural correlation because when I look at things, I think about how this impacts the state of Maine. I'll tell you that you come up 95 and there's a glorious sign there that says open for business, right? Open for business. And drug dealers say open for business. That means I'm going to buy low and I'm going to sell high, right? And not high, and that pun intended there, right? So they're buying heroin cheap. Used to be buying crack cheap, used to be buying this cheap, and then they run it up 95 and they quadruple their money. And then guess what happens to vacation land, right? We become part of what is referred to as the iron pipeline. We run dope north, and then we run guns south. So we come up here, we quadruple our money, we buy guns on the private market from strangers without a background check, and then we run those guns south. And then when you get south, you sell them to people there where they commit crimes. And then you buy what? More dope. And then you bring that back up here to kill our citizens. And then you buy more guns and you go back. So that's not a pipeline or a terminology that the state of Maine wants to be involved with. It's certainly not terminology that the city of Portland, we're top 10 lists all over the place, and we're proud of that, and we should be. Right, Councilor Sustovic? We should be. So we're proud of those things. But we can't keep our head in the sand either to realize that these things don't happen in our backyard, right here in this community. I'll tell you this. I don't believe Dr. Mills is here anymore, but I grew up in Franklin County, and we called Farmington the big city. That's where I'm coming from, you know what I'm saying? So we got the trifecta of firearms issues in this state in regards to open carry. I'll tell you, growing up, my bus driver would put a shotgun up near the front because when he dropped the kids off, he'd pull the bus off on the side of the road. He'd go hunting in between, and then he'd go pick us up. And that is not a story. That's the real deal, right? So open carry in Franklin County is a whole different deal. You like, I wonder if he got something today. But down here, as a chief of the Portland Police Department, somewhere I've been happily and honored to be here for 19 years, I'll tell you that when I have people walking around Congress Street and Forest Avenue with assault weapons, that's a problem. That's a problem for our citizens, and therefore it's a problem for me. I'll talk about carrying concealed weapons. We say open for business. We say, come on up here, buy guns from strangers without a background check. And oh, by the way, you can conceal them while you're at it, and then go south. Why wouldn't you come here, Joseph? Why wouldn't you come to Maine? Why wouldn't you come on up here and buy guns from us and then conceal them wherever you want to? That makes perfect sense. And then we're going to go south. Or maybe they're not going to go south. Maybe they're going to hang around in our communities and do damage. And it happens. It happens right here. Let's talk about background checks a little bit. I do think that backgrounds work. Maine Chiefs of Police Association thinks that background checks, universal background checks, are going to work. And they support that. I support that as a chief of the Portland Police Department. It's not even a question in my mind. I do think there's a potential, as always, for language to change as this thing rolls on through the rest of the system. And that's absolutely a case. And if that's the way it ends up going, that's the way it ends up going. But background checks are low-hanging fruit. It's a no-brainer to have background checks in our state and in our community. It's low-hanging fruit. And now, if we can't ask our elected officials to actually vote for that because they're too scared to do so, that's why the populace here, our citizens, are going to vote that in. So it's not just about this referendum. I'm going to touch on and have touched on all aspects of those firearms issues here in our community. I will tell you on the background check end that we've had stories here, right here in our community. Darian Richardson was killed in this community back in January of 2010. As a matter of fact, in a building over here was a follow-up homicide with that same firearm. Killed in our community. And guess what happened? She was shot in January of that year in a home invasion style shooting. And ultimately, she ended up passing away of complications from that shooting a couple months later. But in between, about 2 weeks after her initial shooting, we had another homicide at 218 Park Avenue. And from that homicide, the suspect ran down the street and ditched a .45 caliber handgun outside of a store down there. And we found the gun. And through working with the Maine State Crime Lab, we determined that this same firearm, the same gun, is used in 2 distinct homicides in the city of Portland. 2 distinct homicides. So we start taking a look at this. We start reviewing this. And now we go, thank God, Judy and Wayne Richardson aren't here. This may be the only meeting that they've ever missed to talk about these issues. A passionate family that was victimized by gun violence. And I'm thinking in my mind, you know what? We've got that golden nugget that's going to be able to help solve this case and bring Darian Richardson's killer to justice. And now we got a gun. We run a serial number. We got an owner. We go to the owner. And guess what happens? The owner sold the gun at a gun show. Has no idea who he sold it to. Doesn't remember. Doesn't have a name. Doesn't remember what they looked like. Now, probably 20% of that is true, maybe less. But did he do anything illegal? No. He did nothing illegal. He could absolutely do that. You could do that today at any gun show that you have across the state. You could absolutely do that. Did nothing wrong. So now we're faced to look at Judy and Wayne, and I've looked at them hundreds of times since then, knowing that we had an opportunity to solve that crime. But yet we couldn't take advantage of that. You know why? Because we sell deadly weapons in the state of Maine, just like they're a broken down chair at a yard sale. Pull on over. I don't need an ID. Here's a buck. Everything must go. And I don't know who I sold it to. It's gone. And it's never for us to be determined again exactly where that went. So that's one story. And I think that if it's one story, I think that's a big story for us. We only average a couple homicides a year. Yes, guess what? That's way too many homicides in our community. And if we look at these percentages, and I'll spin them out, background checks work. 5,500 people have been turned around at gun counters since this started in '98. That's 3,000 felons and 1,200 domestic abusers. I think that works. How many are we going to pick up when we're required to do these on private gun sales? I'd say that there's plenty of examples in states that currently have universal background checks. And there's all kinds of, and everybody loves stats. This is good stuff. 52% fewer mass shootings, 46% fewer fatal DV shootings, 48% fewer police officers fatally shot. My people, your people, that are killed in these communities. Are you kidding me? Is this even a conversation that we're going to have background checks? We're not going to have background checks. The stats are there. They're real. We can talk about, well, this isn't going to work. Apparently other states have figured it out. I'm not selling our citizens short that they can't figure out how they're going to do a gun transfer when they're hunting. I think we're going to be able to figure that out. I know Franklin County people, plenty. We built a log cabin up there. My mom's still up there. We'll be up there throwing wood next weekend, as a matter of fact. And I think the people that I went to high school with are going to be able to figure this out just fine. So I appreciate it. It's unfortunate for me that after Sandy Hook, where I thought, 26 people die, 20 of them happen to be little babies, right? I figured this is it. This is it. This is going to be what pushes us over the top. And I'll tell you, in my book, I think gun laws have regressed in this community and in this country since then. And that's a tragedy, and that's a travesty that I think we can help control in our state for this particular issue. And I'll talk about guns all day if you want. But as far as this referendum goes, I think we can fix that, and we have an opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Mike. We have some questions here. Dimitri, I have a question for you. Everyone's saying that this transfer thing is the big problem. We can rework that. If the people vote yes on 3, can we rework that in the legislature?
Well, sure. Lots of laws are passed that are ultimately amended. If you look at some of the major federal legislation, there's often gaps. You can't fill every gap, and so if we think that something doesn't work well, the legislature can rewrite the laws. My understanding is that in the actual referendum, the word transfer is defined by reference to another part of the statute, another piece of legislation. So all that has to be done is actually not even an amendment of of Proposition 3, but of that other piece that defines the word transfer. So there's nothing stopping the legislature from going back and redefining those terms.
Okay. Please detail precisely what the background check entails, how long it takes, and what questions are asked as of the applicant. Any mental health questions? Who wants
Well,
it?
Yeah, I would say that what I know of it, and I am not a scholar on this particular referendum or any others, but I would say that the intent is to mirror the background check that currently exists for brand new firearms that are bought from federally licensed firearms dealers. So this is no different. You're getting the same, you're giving the same information, you're receiving
And
the
it
same
would be,
information.
you're not a felon, your name, your address, what you're buying.
Correct.
You're not a felon, and
Yeah, and I can tell you that I've had background checks privately. I own guns. I've been carrying a firearm for the last 25 years in uniform, and I think the average turnaround is a couple minutes to get a background check back. And I believe the last stats show that 98.5% of Mainers have a federally licensed firearms dealer within 10 miles of their house. So it's the exact same form, exact same system, going to the same exact people.
And I would just add to that, I mean, as I was talking about, the means have to be tied to the ends. And so, of course, if the questions are too broad, or if they don't go towards the categories that can be excluded, then there could be a potential challenge to those questions being asked, right? So the questions being asked in the background check has to be tailored to identifying the people who are not allowed to buy the guns.
I know why they have me here today now. I live in Bridgeton. See, I can do that. I have seen more than 20 vote no signs on 3, 0 vote yes on 3. And you know why that is? Because they weren't paying very much attention. They were more like 40 or 50. But anyway, how do you get past the mantra, they are taking away our guns? How do you get the message in?
Easy, Bill. We're not. I mean, sometimes the argument is that long. We're not taking their guns. But I will say something about the signs, and it might be helpful for individuals here in this room to consider. When we held hearings on the original universal background check bill, this wouldn't have been a large enough space for those who were prepared to testify. As a matter of fact, I know it caused consternation for the Capitol Police as they tried to create the logistics to handle all the witnesses. And then the 5 people speaking in favor of the bill showed up. And I think that's important. For many of us, firearm violence is a secondary issue on our agenda of life. But for those who really see the control of their lives as an individual responsibility that shouldn't be trespassed by government, it's the only issue. So
Then
I
why-
had to
why
remind
does-
the committee, do not be swayed simply by the number of faces here, because we're a big state with lots of folks, and they're allowed to make their own decisions. They're just not here exercising.
So you're saying the hearing is overrun with the no side. Why is the poll saying 60-40 yes, if the signs are saying 80-2 no? I want to have my own
Try it
question.
again.
Why, I believe there was a poll in the Press Herald that said 60% of Mainers favor question 3, will vote yes on 3.
Yes.
The signs, it's 50-1. Why is that? Is there money on the no side?
never, as a
I thought
politician-
the money was on the yes
Bill,
side.
listen, as a politician, I never worry about signs because they've yet to vote.
Yeah.
I mean, this afternoon, I could go out and put out 100 signs for Mark Dion. I'll be very excited. All right?
They gotta be 30
And none of
feet
them will
apart,
show up and vote for me. Right? But it creates an impression. I'm just saying, when we were in the legislature, we tried to be conscious of the fact that this is a big state with a lot of opinions and a lot of expectations, and they may or may not be reflected simply by the presence of lots of people in opposition to what we believed was a common sense strategy, and one that was supported by Republicans and Democrats. There are also Democrats that do not support this. And I'll close with this, and the chief's right. It's really simple, and this is what we told the committee. If it's predictable, it's preventable. Everything we do today has to satisfy that maxim. So background checks are an instrument that responds to the idea that violence is predictable for certain individuals, and therefore it is preventable by adopting this particular policy.
Mike, let's talk about that person that murdered two people, threw the gun away. You found the gun but never found the murderer.
Actually, what happened was that we did find the murderer for 218 Park Avenue. It did turn into more of a scenario you would see, I believe, in a larger city, where this was a crime gun
Yep.
that had been moved for multiple people. So it was utilized first in the home invasion shooting that involved Darian, and then it was transferred to somebody
Weren't they
else.
trying to shoot her boyfriend?
Both were ultimately hit, but Darian was the one that passed away.
Okay.
Yeah, so then the firearm is used at a secondary homicide, completely separate of the first, and that individual's doing 30-something years in prison right now. So Darian's is unsolved at this point.
I think there is another factor to the sign imbalance question, Bill. I mean, I think, when I think, I'm a sort of my friends would tell you I'm very brave, but, underneath I'm sort of a wuss. And I'm telling you, I haven't put a yes on 3 sign on my lawn. I put a yes on 5, I think, but I didn't put a yes on 3 because I'm a little frightened. And I live in a district that is like 85% in favor of background checks. But the other 15%, including the guy around the corner, got a lot of guns, and I'm a little wussy about it, I don't want to put myself at risk. And I think the same is true all over the rural parts of this state. I'm not saying there aren't a lot of people in opposition to this referendum in those areas, but I think there are a lot of people who are in their homes and in favor of this referendum that are not putting signs on their lawns for the same reasons that I'm not putting a sign on my lawn. And so I think it's, you can't, I agree with Mark, you can't, the signs are not going to vote. And they do have to be 30 feet apart, you should know, in case you see a lot of them.
Would police have discretion in a transfer situation such as not necessarily giving a speeding ticket in all situations? So Luther and Fred go up hunting, Luther comes home 2 days early, Fred still got the gun, and we pick him up Sunday afternoon coming south from Holton on 95.
The infamous Luther and Fred scenario.
You know those guys.
I think that for me, we're ultimately going to have to see exactly what the statute looks like. We do investigations. That's what we do for a living. So I envision very few scenarios where Luther or Fred is cuffed on the side of the road because there's a scenario here. This requires some follow-up, some ATF traces on what was background checked, what wasn't. As this moves forward, there would have to be some determination on what kind of data is available real time to police officers that are on the street. So I'm not going to have a solid answer for that because I don't know exactly what that's going to look like at the end of the day. And I would say this, Bill, because I was confusing you probably with the 45 caliber. The 218 Park Avenue had additional evidence and additional information for us to follow, which is how we brought that suspect into custody. The Darian situation, we have exhausted many leads in that scenario, and we're down to, hey, look, we have a gun to get our hands on.
Right.
And that would have been the key piece of evidence for that particular scenario.
But Steph, you would say that gun wouldn't have been bought legally had we had background checks like are being suggested.
The gun used in the,
Right, those two, homicide, one's a homicide anyway.
I don't know if it would have been or not.
Well, it'd be hard to judge the success of question 3 when it passes because it's mostly about prevention. We can do it statistically as a public health issue. Yes.
You probably hear me anyway, but really all you have to do is look at states that don't have background checks, and there's 33 of them. So you can look at their homicide and their suicide and their accident rates compared to states that do have background checks. And you will see it's irrefutable evidence that states with tougher gun laws, starting with a background check, have lower gun fatality rates than states with lax gun laws. And it's just common sense. I mean, good public policy leads generally to good public health outcomes, and vice versa. So it's a choice. And you know, getting back to the sign thing, I will also say, as a guy that gets more than, you know, a little hate mail and death threats, you know, these are cowards. They hide behind their email addresses, and they do nothing. But they do a great job at intimidation. They intimidate you, they intimidate the Democrats, and generally they own the Republicans in a democracy. So, you know, good public health and good public policy can work to reduce any kind of epidemic. And the very beginning of that process is a background check, but it's going to take people not being intimidated and people holding their legislators and the other voters accountable.
Would a greater, I don't understand this question, so somebody help me out if I'm not getting it correctly. Would a, quote, greater harms, end quote, defense protect the innocent transfer for prevention of suicide as a necessity? What? Okay, it doesn't say that, but would a competing harms defense protect the innocent transfer for prevention of suicide as a necessity? Get a question out of that for me, would you, and answer it?
Look, just because we're lawyers, it doesn't have to be this hard.
Well, you know, the comment about, you know, look at the states that have this law. Maine has the lowest homicide rate in the nation. And we have this freewheeling gun law situation. So I don't buy that. And I don't buy that intimidation is only going one way. The thing that that disturbs me about this whole issue is that we are pretending to talk about how we're going to resolve violence in the state of Maine by signing on to this bill that, as I said, you know, background checks are fine. I don't have a problem with that. But I don't think it's going to change the overall complexion. So we can go ahead and vote this in and, you know, deal with changing it in the legislature, which is never very easy. But you're not really dealing. I mean, Lois, how many of those domestic violence victims that were shot with handguns that would not have been obtained if there had been background checks? No one's asking that question.
I don't know that. The only question would be if there was already a separation caused by a protection from abuse order, then the perpetrator would be prohibited, and those are the ones that would be prevented by this law. But some of them, you're right, the gun's already there, and it's not.
I mean, we don't know. And
Mike, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
with
Mike,
the-
you said you weren't going to talk after your 5 minutes, but I think you are.
I think I'm ready to go. So I think just a couple things that, you know, when I think about what we do for a living, I will be the first to tell you that from a law enforcement perspective, we don't eliminate risk. We do not eliminate risk. We mitigate risk to the best of our ability. There is nothing that anybody can do to say this is never going to happen over there or you are absolutely safe. You know, I guess there's probably a movie with a safe room somewhere or whatever, but that's not reality. That's not how we live. So I don't look at background checks as the panacea, right? We're going to end it right there. Background checks is going to solve all the world's problems. But when I talk about the greatest overall impact, an immediate impact, in the first layer of that, I think that background checks are imperative. I would also say that I started by talking about two epidemics. When people say, look at the statistics around mass shootings, and look how many people are mentally ill, I would say, yes, that's a good point. So what are we doing about people that are mentally ill? Not just, oh, we're not going to do background checks because it doesn't work over here, or it's not going to solve the whole problem. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I do think we need to hit multiple levels of this. That's a common sense, practical, main approach to this, is not just to simply say background checks are going to rule the day and everybody's going to be safe after that. The percentages would show that it's going to be a safer community. So, but I do think that we do need to branch out and to address some of these other issues that are for sure. Other things that popped up that I didn't address, talking about, well, bad guys aren't going to get background checks anyway. So they're not going to follow through, so what are we doing? And that's a license to throw out every law we have on the books, if that's the case. We got 163 cops. I'm walking a footbeat by myself tomorrow because all of a sudden, just because people aren't going to naturally abide by the law, we're going to just throw them all out. I do think, again, if we're catching all these felons, we're catching these domestic abusers that want to get firearms, they're walking up to a counter and asking about it, that there's a lot to be said for just branching out with that background check system and addressing that universally.
There must be a substantial reservoir of guns in Maine. Do we need to ultimately reduce gun numbers, or just who has them to reduce gun violence?
Well,
All right, so do we have to reduce gun numbers?
I think there's a misconception that what we've been talking about is going to do anything about that, because the guns are already there. I mean, it's not like everybody in their closet has to go bring their closet to has to get checked before they can.
This is the Australian model.
Yeah.
This is all code for what's going on there. And it began, you see, there's some that believe government is a creeper, right? We creep. And every time we creep, we keep our territory and we move forward. And the Australians have used their gun laws to seize and remove them from the households. I just want to follow up on something the chief said. The other part of that bill we did pass had to do with mental health. There's a lot of talk about mental health. We tried in that statute to create a group that would look at the question of individuals that are brought to hospitals to be considered for commitment because they posed a risk either to themselves or to the community at large. And my God, it was a jungle. It was a legal jungle. One, doctors would much rather decide that somebody does not pose a risk to him or herself in the immediate sense, therefore it creates the opportunity for release. The police are saying, well, no, our history with this individual would say the community safety is at risk. And if by some reason you do decide they need hospitalization, let's hope like hell he or she agrees to commitment, so therefore they don't enter the very category we're trying to manage. Now, I only want to jump on the mic because the law school puts out a really great little magazine, and this month's issue, a quarterly issue, has to do with health care law. Well, I know the legislature, we need some bright infusion of ideas about how we're going to get through HIPAA and our commitment to personal privacy, which is equal to our commitment to guns, if we're going to deal with the mental health issue so that the chief can do something if we come across those issues. And that's where the next line is going to be drawn, is there.
And I think the other thing that's come up today that I think is really good, because it's not talked about around gun safety issues as often as it ought to be, and that's the whole issue of suicide. I mean, I think that really is, certainly my understanding of the dynamics of statistics are greatly enhanced by the discussion today. I came into this meeting today thinking only about my own personal experience with a niece who committed suicide with a firearm this year, and who's 35 years old with 2 kids just graduating from high school. And do I blame the gun? No, I blame the Chantix, frankly, that she was on to try to quit smoking, that no one in her family knew she was taking, but it's still, the suicide ripped the family. It was tragic for her kids, her husband, and the extended family, because all of these issues, substance abuse, mental health, so all of these things don't just impact the person who is killed or damaged fatally in some way. They damage the kids, they damage the partners, they damage the whole family, they damage the community, frankly. And I think that we don't look enough about the interconnectedness of all these issues, and all of these issues, even if you look at them singly, how they're all interconnected with multiple layers of people.
John?
Sure. So I get this all the time. There's 300 million guns out there, so what are you going to do? How is that going to have any impact? The good news is states with these more comprehensive gun laws that deal with the constituent groups, starting with just making it harder for criminals and the dangerously mentally ill to get guns, We're talking about risk reduction. We can't prevent it all. But the amazing thing that, after 20 plus years of doing this in Massachusetts, I can't believe that we've been able to reduce gun deaths. And this is all gun deaths. Suicides matter. Homicides and accidents matter. So it's all about trying to, reduce that without an infringement on our rights. But in Massachusetts, with Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and 30 other states, not even that you can drive to quickly in many cases, we still were able to reduce gun deaths by 60%. So that's the good news, folks. And I can tell you, as David said earlier in the panel, there's very few people know as much as Harvard School of Public Health and David, who has been focused on this for so long. The good news is 3% of the population have 50% of the guns. And, the gun industry is trying to sell fear in order to sell guns to women, and they're not buying it at the rate that knucklehead, guys like us are. So then where do you go? Well, you go to the criminal element, which is the biggest market, and how do you sell to them? You don't know they're a criminal, which is the background check. So it's just plain common sense.
Dimitri.
Yeah, just one thing I'd add is, no law can address an entire problem in and of itself. And so I think the last question that's asking about, the guns that are out there, a background bill doesn't foreclose other options that the people can consider, including, gun buyback programs and other solutions other states have tried. So taking piecemeal approach, even if it doesn't solve a problem, if it fixes it a little bit, it's a worthwhile effort. And the other piece is that causation is always hard to prove, and so it's hard to kind of definitively prove that a certain law led to a certain result. All we can kind of go with is correlation, but the studies that have been out there, including a kind of recent study by Johns Hopkins looking at Missouri and some other states, has suggested background checks work. Again, they didn't prove that they caused a reduction in crime or an increase when the background check stopped, but we do have correlation. That's pretty strong evidence.
Anyone have anything they want to add? We have just a couple of minutes. I'll then thank you all for coming. We're going to have a reception. If you'd like to, is it buttonhole anybody on the panel? You can do that at that reception. And as they say in Chicago, vote early and often come November 3rd.